Welcome to Blessed Man Meditations. My name is Andy. On this YouTube channel, I offer thoughtful responses to skeptical objections to the Christian faith. I likewise edify the saints by equipping them to provide an answer for the hope that lies within them. I hope that you find value in my work. Please like my videos, send me comments, and please subscribe. Let's work together to contend earnestly for the faith that's been once for all delivered to the saints. Blessed Man Meditations, we provide answers to the intellectual side of Christianity and equip Christians to provide a defense for the hope that is in them. This time on Blessed Man Meditations, we continue our look at clearing up supposed Bible contradictions. Part 2. Last time was just introductory comments. This time, we actually begin looking at the contradictions. This time, we'll do contradictions 1 through 10. This comes from a list from a United Kingdom Center of Apologetics by the name of Vander. I guess that's how that's pronounced. These are the contributors. So the first contradiction is, the question is, does God incite David to conduct the census of his people, or does Satan incite David to conduct the census of his people? And the reason people look at this as a contradiction is because they misunderstand how God works in history. So let's begin by looking at what the verses actually say. 2 Samuel chapter 24 verse 1 says, "Again, the anger of the Lord was aroused against Israel, and the Lord moved David against them to say, Go and number Israel and Judah." Then in 1 Chronicles chapter 21, it says Satan stood up against Israel and moved David to number Israel. So who was it? Did the Lord move David to number Israel, or did Satan move David to number Israel? Well, this seems like an apparent discrepancy, unless, of course, both statements are true. So the Center for Apologetics is saying that it's both Satan and the Lord who were moving David to number Israel. It was towards the end of David's reign, and David was looking back over his brilliant conquests, which had brought the Canaanite, Syrian, and Phoenician kingdoms into a state of vassalage and dependency on Israel. He had an attitude of pride and self-admiration for his achievements, and was thinking more in terms of armaments and troops than in terms of the mercies of God. The Lord therefore decided that it was time that David be brought to his knees, where he'd once again be cast back onto the mercy of God. So the Lord brought about the circumstance to humble David. So he let him go ahead with his census. He gave David the freedom to carry out his own sinful will, David's own sinful will. So he let him go ahead with his census in order to find out just how much good it would do him, as the only thing the census would accomplish would be to inflate the national ego, intimated in Joab's warning against carrying out the census in 1 Chronicles chapter 21, verse 3. As Joab tried to convince David not to go through with the census. As soon as the numbering was completed, God intended to chasten the nation with a disastrous plague, which would bring about an enormous loss of life. In fact, the lives of 70,000 Israelites, according to 2 Samuel 24, verse 15, 70,000 Israelites died, according to 2 Samuel 24:15. So what about Satan? Why would he get himself involved in this affair, according to 1 Chronicles 21, verse 1, if God had already prompted David to commit the folly he had in mind? It seems his reasons were entirely malicious. Satan's reasons were entirely malicious. That's consistent with Satan's character, knowing that a census would displease the Lord. So he also incited David to carry it through. Yet this is nothing new, for there are a number of other occurrences in the Bible where both the Lord and Satan were involved in soul-searching testings and trials. In the book of Job, chapters 1 and 2, we find a challenge to Satan from God, allowing Satan to bring upon Job his calamities. God's purpose was to purify Job's faith and to strengthen his character by means of discipline through adversity, whereas Satan's purpose was purely malicious, wishing Job as much harm as possible so that he would recant his faith in God. Similarly, both God and Satan are involved in the sufferings of persecuted Christians. according to 1 Peter 4:19 and 5:8 and 1 Peter 5:8. God's purpose in allowing Christians to suffer is to strengthen their faith and to enable them to share in the sufferings of Christ in this life, that they may rejoice with him in the glories of heaven to come. Whereas Satan's purpose of the Christians' suffering in this life is to devour them, or rather to draw them into self-pity and bitterness and down to Satan's level. Both God and Satan allowed Jesus the 3 temptations during his ministry on earth. God's purpose for these temptations was for Jesus to triumph completely over the very tempter who had lured the first Adam to his fall, whereas Satan's purpose was to deflect the Savior from his messianic mission. So did God incite David to conduct the census, or did Satan incite David to conduct the census? The answer is both. In the case of Peter's denials, 3 denials of Jesus in the court of the high priest, it was Jesus himself who points out the purposes of both parties' involvement when he says in Luke chapter 22, verses 31 and 32, Simon, Simon, which was Jesus' name for Peter, pre-Christian Peter, Simon, Simon, Satan is asked to sift you as wheat, but I've prayed for you, Simon, that your faith may not fail. I guess he's reminding Peter that he's weak, which is true for the genuine Christian. They realize that they are weak, that they don't have the strength in themselves to overcome temptation, that they need God's help. But Jesus prayed for Peter that his faith would not fail, and when you've turned back, strengthen your brothers. Yeah, this was Jesus predicted the denials, but also the restoration of Peter. And finally, the crucifixion itself bears out yet another example where both God and Satan are involved. Satan exposed his purpose when he had the heart of Judas filled with treachery and hate, causing him to betray Jesus. The Lord's reasoning behind the crucifixion, however, was that Jesus, the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world, should give his life as a ransom for many, so that once again sinful man could relish in the relationship lost at the very beginning in the Garden of Eden, and thereby enter into a relationship which is now eternal. Thus, we have 5 other examples where both the Lord and Satan were involved together, though with entirely different motives. Satan's motive in all these examples, including the census by David, was driven by malicious intent, while the Lord in all these cases showed an entirely different motive. The Lord's motive was a benevolent motive with a view to eventual victory, while simultaneously increasing the usefulness of the person tested, in this case David. In every case, Satan's success was limited and transient, while in the end God's purpose was well served in furthering his cause substantially. So, the allegation is, the allegation of contradiction is, did God incite David to conduct the census, or did Satan incite David to conduct the census? And the answer is both. Alleged contradiction number 2. 2 Samuel 24:9 gives the total population for Israel at 800,000, whereas 1 Chronicles 21:5 says it was 1.1 million. So this is a misunderstanding of the historical context, or a misunderstanding of the author's intent. First, let's look at the verses. 2 Samuel 24 verse 9 says, Then Joab gave the sum of the number of the people to the king. And there were in Israel 800,000 valiant men who drew the sword, and the men of Judah were 500,000 men. 1 Chronicles chapter 21 verse 5 says, Then Joab gave the sum of the number of the people to David. All Israel had 1,100,000 men who drew the sword, and Judah had 470,000 men who drew the sword. Those are the 2 verses. There are a number of ways to understand not only this problem, but the next challenge as well, since they both refer to the same passages and to the same census. It is possible that the differences between the 2 accounts are related to the unofficial and incomplete nature of the census, which will be discussed later, or that the book of Samuel presents rounded numbers, particularly for Judah. The more likely answer, however, is that one census includes categories of men that the other excludes. It is quite conceivable that the 1 Chronicles 21:5 figure included all the available men of fighting age, whether battle seasoned or not, whereas the 2 Samuel 24:9 account is speaking of only those who were ready for battle. Joab's report in 2 Samuel 24 uses the word Israel, which is translated as mighty men or battle-seasoned troops, and refers to them numbering 800,000 veterans. It is reasonable that there were an additional 300,000 men of military age kept in the reserves, but not yet involved in field combat. The two groups would therefore make up 1.1 million men in the 1 Chronicles 21 account, which does not employ the Hebrew term Israel to describe them. It doesn't appear that either one of them is necessarily wrong. It's just what the author meant to include. 2 Samuel chapter 24, verse 9 gives the round figure of 500,000 fighting men in Judah, which was 30,000 more than the corresponding item in 1 Chronicles 21, verse 5. This is a misunderstanding of the historical context. Observe that 1 Chronicles 21, verse 6 clearly states that Joab did not complete the numbering, as he had not yet taken a census of the tribe of Benjamin, nor that of Levi's either, due to the fact that David came under conviction about completing the census at all. Thus, the different numbers indicate the inclusion or exclusion of particular unspecified groups in the nation. Find another reference to this in 1 Chronicles 27, verses 23 and 24, where it states that David did not include those 20 years and younger, and that since Joab did not finish the census, the number was not recorded in King David's chronicle. The procedure for conducting the census had been to start with the Transjordanian tribes from 2 Samuel 24:5, and then shift to the northernmost tribe of Dan and work southward toward Jerusalem in verse 7. The numbering of Benjamin, therefore, would have come last. Hence, Benjamin would not be included with the total for Israel or of that for Judah either. In the case of 2 Samuel 24, the figure of Judah included the already known figure of 30,000 troops mustered by Benjamin, hence the total of 500,000 included the Benjamite contingent. Observe that after the division of the United Kingdom into the north and south, following the death of Solomon in 930 BC, most of the Benjamites remained loyal to the dynasty of David and constituted, along with Simeon to the south and the kingdom of Judah. Hence, it was reasonable to include Benjamin with Judah and Simeon in the subtotal figure of 500,000, even though Joab may not have itemized it in the first report that he gave to David. Therefore, the completed grand total of fighting forces available to David for military service was 1.6 million, 1.1 million of Israel, 470,000 of Judah, Simeon, and 30,000 of Benjamin. Okay, number 4 of 10 on this one. 2 Samuel 24, verse 13 mentions that there will be 7 years of famine, whereas 1 Chronicles 21, verse 12, where it mentions only 3 years of famine. This is a misunderstanding of the author's intent and a misunderstanding of the wording. There are 2 ways to look at this. The first is to assume that the author of 1 Chronicles emphasized the 3-year period in which the famine was to be most intense, whereas the author of 2 Samuel includes the 2 years prior to and after this period, during which the famine worsened and lessened respectively. Another solution can be noticed by observing the usage of the words in each passage. When you compare the 2 passages, you will note that the wording is significantly different in 1 Chronicles 21 from that found in 2 Samuel 24. In 2 Samuel 24, verse 13, the question is, shall 7 years of famine come to you? Be shall. In 1 Chronicles 21:12, you find an alternative imperative. Take for yourselves out of the 3 years of famine. From this, we may reasonably conclude that 2 Samuel records the first approach of the prophet Gad to David, in which the alternative prospect was 7 years, whereas the Chronicles account gives us the second and final approach of Nathan to the king, in which the Lord, doubtless in response to David's earnest entreaty and private prayer, reduced the severity of that grim alternative to 3 years rather than an entire span of 7. As it turned out, however, David opted for God's third preference and thereby received 3 days of severe pestilence, resulting in the deaths of 70,000 men in Israel. All right, number 5 was Ahaziah, 22 years old, or like it says in 2 Kings 8:26, or was Ahaziah 42 years old, like it says in 2 Chronicles 22, verse 2, when he began to rule in Jerusalem? Well, this is a copyist error. Because we're dealing with accounts which were written thousands of years ago, we would not expect to have the originals in our possession today, as they would have disintegrated long ago. We're therefore dependent on the copies taken from the copies of those originals, which were in turn continually copied over a period of centuries. Those who did the copying were prone to making two types of scribal errors. One concerned the spelling of proper names, and the other had to do with numbers. Two examples of numerical discrepancy here have to do with the decade and the number given. Ahaziah is said to be 22 years old in 2 Kings 8:26, while in 2 Chronicles 22, verse 2, Ahaziah is said to have been 42 years old. Fortunately, there's enough additional information in the biblical text to show that the correct number is 22. Earlier, in 2 Kings 8:17, the author mentions that Ahaziah's father, Joram ben Ahab, was 32 when he became king, and he died 8 years later at the age of 40. Therefore, Ahaziah could not have been 42 at the time of his father's death at age 40. Such scribal errors do not change Jewish or Christian beliefs in the least. In such a case, another portion of Scripture often corrects the mistake. In this instance, that portion that corrects the mistake is 2 Kings 8:26. We must also remember that the scribes who were responsible for the copies were meticulously honest in handling biblical texts. They delivered them as they received them, without changing even obvious mistakes, which are few indeed. Refer to the next question for a more in-depth presentation on how scribes could misconstrue numbers within manuscripts. Halfway done. Number 6. Was Jehoiakim 18 years old, like it says in 2 Kings 24:8, or was he 8 years old, as it says in 2 Chronicles 36:9, when he became king of Jerusalem? This again is a copyist error. Here are the two verses. 2 Kings 24:8 says Jehoiakim was 18 years old. 2 Chronicles 36:9 says he was 8 years old when he became king. Once again, there's enough information in the context of these two passages to tell us that 8 is wrong and 18 is right. The age of 8 is unusually young to assume governmental leadership. However, there are certain commentators who contend that this can be entirely possible. They maintain that when Jehoiakim was 8 years old, his father made him co-regent so that he could be trained in the responsibilities of leading a kingdom. Jehoiakim then became officially a king at the age of 18 upon his father's death. So that's one way of handling that supposed contradiction. A more likely scenario, however, is that this is yet another case of scribal error evidenced commonly with numbers. It may be helpful to interject here that there were 3 known ways of writing numbers in Hebrew. The earliest, a series of notations used by the Jewish settlers in the 5th century BC, elephantine papyri, described in more detail below, was followed by a system whereby alphabetical letters were used for numbers. A further system was introduced whereby the spelling out of the numbers was prescribed by the Guild of Soparim. Fortunately, we have a large file of documents and papyrus from these 3 sources to which we can refer. As with many of these numerical discrepancies, it is the decade number that varies. It is instructive to observe that the number notations used by the Jewish settlers in the 5th century BC elephantine papyri during the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, from which this passage comes, evidences the earlier form of numerical notation. This consisted of a horizontal stroke ending in a downward hook at its right end to represent the numbers in tens. Thus, 2 horizontal strokes, one above the other, would be 20. Vertical strokes were used to represent anything less than 10. Thus, 8 would be that, but 18 would be that, with the addition of a horizontal line and a downward hook above it. Similarly, 22 would be that, followed by 2 horizontal hooks, and 42 would be that, followed by 2 sets of horizontal. So you can see how it's easy to miscopy numbers. If then the primary manuscript from which a copy was being carried out was blurred or smudged, one or more of the decadal notations could be missed by the copyist. It's far less likely that the copyist would have mistakenly seen an extra 10 stroke that was not present in his original than that he would have failed to observe one that had been smudged. In the New International Version of the Bible, the NIV, the corrections have been included in the texts. However, for clarity, footnotes at the bottom of the page mention that earlier Hebrew manuscripts include the scribal error, while the Septuagint manuscripts and Syriac, as well as one Hebrew manuscript, include the correct numerals. It only makes sense to correct the numerals once the scribal error has been noted. This, however, in no way negates the authenticity nor the authority of the scriptures which we have. Confirmation of this type of copyist error is found in various pagan writers as well. For example, in the Behistun rock inscription set up by Darius I, we find that number 38 gives the figure for the slain of the army of Frata as 55,243 with 6,572 prisoners according to the Babylonian column. Copies of this inscription found in Babylon itself records the number of prisoners as 6,973. However, in the Aramaic translation of this inscription discovered at the Elephantine in Egypt, the number of prisoners was only 6,972. Similarly, in number 31 of this same inscription, the Babylonian column gives 2,045 as the number of slain in the rebellious army of Frawartish, along with 1,558 prisoners, whereas the Aramaic copy has over 1,575 as the prisoner count. So, copyist error is the source of contradiction number 6, Jehoiakim's age. Number 7 of 10. Did King Jehoiakim rule over Jerusalem for 3 months, like it says in 2 Kings 24, verse 8, or for 3 months and 10 days, like it says in 2 Chronicles 36, chapter 36, verse 9? Well, this supposed contradiction happened because of misunderstanding of the author's intent. Here again, as we found in challenge number 2 and number 4, the author of Chronicles has been more specific with his numbering, whereas the author of Kings is simply rounding off the number of months, assuming that the additional 10 days is not significant enough to mention. All right, that was number 7. Number 8. Did the chief of the mighty men of David? So, just to recap there, number 7, it's just a matter of what did they think was important enough to include. Not really a real contradiction. Number 8. Did the chief of the mighty men of David lift up his spear and killed 800 men, like it says in 2 Samuel 23:8, or only 300 men, like it says in 1 Chronicles 11, verse 11, category, misunderstood the historical context or misunderstood the author's intent. So did he kill 800 or 300? Okay. 2 Samuel chapter 23, verse 8, these are the names of the mighty men whom David had. Josheb Basshebeth, the Tachmonite, chief among the captains. He was called Adino Eznite because he had killed 800 men at one time. 1 Chronicles 11:11. This is the number of the mighty men whom David had. Jeshobim, son of a Hachmonite, chief of the captains, he lifted up a spear against 300 and killed by him at one time. It's quite possible that both authors may have described 2 different incidents, though by the same man, or one author may have only mentioned in part what the other author mentions in full. Okay. 2 more. Did David bring the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem after defeating the Philistines, like it says in 2 Samuel 5 and 6, or before defeating the Philistines, as it says in 1 Chronicles chapters 13 and 14? This is not really a problem. Critics should have continued reading on further to 1 Chronicles 15, as the critic would then have seen that David had brought the ark after defeating the Philistines. The reason for this is that the Israelites moved the Ark of the Covenant twice. First time they moved it from Baal prior to the defeat of the Philistines, as we see in 2 Samuel 5 and 6 and in 1 Chronicles 15. Once the prophet Samuel narrates David's victory over the Philistines, he tells us about both times when the ark was moved. However, in 1 Chronicles, the order is as follows. The ark was first moved from Baal. Then David defeated the Philistines, and finally the ark was moved from the house of Obed-Edom. Therefore, the 2 accounts are not contradictory at all. What we have here is simply one prophet choosing to give us the complete history of the ark at once, rather than referring to it later, and another presenting the history in a different way. In both cases, the timing of events is the same. Number 10. Was Noah supposed to bring 2 pairs of all living creatures, like it says in Genesis chapter 6, verses 19 and 20, or was he to bring 7 pairs of clean animals, like it says in Genesis chapter 7, verse 2? See also 7, 8, and 9. So, all right. This is indeed an odd question to raise. It's obvious that Shabbir Ally, the noted Muslim scholar who raised these 101 contradictions, has misquoted the text in Genesis chapter 6, which makes no mention of any clean animals in its figure, while the 7th chapter specifically delineates between the clean and unclean animals. Genesis chapter 7, verse 2 says Noah was to bring in 7 pairs of clean animals and 2 pairs of every kind of unclean animal. Why did Shabbir, the Muslim scholar, not mention the second half of this verse, which stipulates 2 pairs in his challenge? It is obvious that there's no discrepancy between the 2 accounts. The problem is the question itself. Shabbir Ally, the Muslim scholar, attempts to back his argument by mentioning that verses 8 and 9 of chapter 7 prove that only 2 pairs went into the ark. However, these verses say nothing about 2 pairs entering the ark. They simply say that it was pairs of clean and unclean animals or birds and creatures which entered the ark. The reason for including 7 of the clean species is perfectly evident. They were to be used for sacrificial worship after the flood had receded, as indeed they were, according to Genesis chapter 8, verse 20. Obviously, if there had not been more than 2 of each of these clean species, they would have been rendered extinct by their being sacrificed on the altar. But, in the case of the unclean animals and birds, a single pair would suffice, since they would not be needed for blood sacrifice. So that is the end of part 1. Part 1 was just contradictions. Part 1 was just contradictions 1 through 10. There are going to be a total of 101 contradictions addressed in this series of videos. I do not yet know how many videos this series will turn into. But this was part 2 and the first 10 contradictions. The next video begins with contradiction number 11. So please stay tuned for that. Please like, comment, and subscribe, and I hope you have a blessed rest of your day.